Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our discussion, Beyond Resilience, Making Music Docs That Aren't One Note. I am your moderator, your humbled moderator this afternoon, Fredara Hadley. I'm an ethnomusicologist and writer. And we're going to work and introduce you to each of our esteemed panelists by way of their bio and a clip of their work so we can all kind of ground ourselves in the room together. Making sure I have my notes here. Let me just say who we have on the stage, and then I'll do that. We have Stanley Nelson. We have Sabaah. I always just call you by your first name. And I just
Folayan.
Folayan. Sabaah Folayan. And Isabel Castro. So we're going to start by watching a clip for the new documentary Beyond Resilience. I don't know if you want to say anything about it before we watch it, or we just want to play the clip. Let it go. That feels like the perfect overture for our conversation today, because in the spirit of that, we want to have real conversations about the diversity that these films, each of these stories, each of these filmmakers bring to our canon of music documentaries, and how they maintain the complexity of the people and the stories told within them. So with that, we're going to start with Stanley Nelson's documentary, Birth of the Cool. And Stanley Nelson is today's leading documentarian of the African-American experience. His films combine compelling narratives with rich historical detail to shine new light on the underexplored American past. Awards received over the course of his career include a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, 5 Primetime Emmy Awards, and Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Emmys and IDA. In 2013, Nelson received the National Medal in the Humanities from President Obama. In 2019, Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool was nominated by the Grammys for Best Music Film and went on to win 2 Emmy Awards at the 42nd Annual News and Documentary Emmy Awards ceremony. So, Stanley, if you would like to share with us before we watch this clip from Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody, for being here. So we're going to watch a little clip from Miles. So this comes about 20 minutes into the film. Miles has already played with Charlie Parker at age 18. He gets into drugs and hits bottom, and then kind of comes off the drugs and plays this magnificent piece at the Newport Jazz Festival. From the very beginning, one of the things we wanted to do is to have a section in the film where we talked about Miles's ballads. And this is a section of the film where we talk about Miles's ballads. Also, and we can talk about this more, I think one of the challenges of music films is how do you incorporate the music? How do you show the music? How do you can't just stop the film, 5 or 6, 10 times and play a 3-minute clip of music. So how do you incorporate the music, into the film? And so I think this section is an example of, how we did it for Miles.
Keep your questions and your thoughts in mind. We're definitely going to have time for Q&A and unpack each story a bit more, but I want to make sure that we get to all see a little bit of each film. So we're going to go to Sabaah and Look at Me, a story on XXXTentacion, which is similar to the Miles Davis documentary in my mind, men with incredibly complex lives and stories that need to be told. And so would you mind sharing a little bit about the film and setting up the clip we'll watch?
Yes, this clip you're about to see is a moment in the film where I transition between the 2 parallel stories, the story of his intimate partner who he allegedly abused very severely, and his own story and his rise to fame. And for me, it was really important going into making this film that his intimate partner be represented. Obviously, I am a woman, and I am someone who feels very strongly about supporting and believing survivors and assuming that, they're coming forward is an act of courage and an act of honesty. And for me doing my background research, it was clear going in that she was telling the truth. And I came to her family and I was like, I understand her to be telling the truth, and this film will have to make that clear in order for me to be a part of it. And so I was really honored that they were open to that. But in the execution, it became a little different because the question is always, well, why aren't you just focused on the music? Why is it about the music? The fans, there's a huge fan base. I think when you're making music documentaries, especially about people with a legacy, there's kind of this voice of the fans, and you have this voice in your mind of what people want to hear, what people want to know. Will they be disappointed? Will they be happy? And you kind of have to tune that out. But you also have to respect that attention is there. And so this was a moment and a transition that I found that I felt was a really strong way to sort of remind people that it was deeper than just the story of the craft.
Okay. Yes, clap it up.
Thank you.
You wanted to say?
Yeah. Oh, this was actually a different clip than what I expected to play. So this will really go with the introduction that I made. But I'm happy to share.
And it's streaming on Hulu.
It is streaming on Hulu. Yeah.
And Miles Davis' Birth of the Cool is streaming on Netflix. And we'll get to Mija in a second. I realized I was so excited thinking about the connections, I forgot to read your bio. I'm going to do that because I want to make sure everybody knows how fantastic you are. Through screenwriting, filmmaking, and public speaking, Sabaah Folayan levels an optimistic yet unflinching gaze on the urgent questions of our time. Sabaah made her directorial debut at the 2017 Sundance Film Festival with the feature-length documentary, Whose Streets? Nominated for Peabody, Critics' Choice, Gotham, and NAACP awards. The film chronicles the experiences of activists living in Ferguson, Missouri, when Michael Brown Jr. was killed. In 2021, Sabaah wrote the series finale of HBO's Betty, a critically acclaimed comedy series about a crew of young female skateboarders in New York City. Her second feature documentary, Look at Me, XXXTentacion, premiered right here at South by Southwest last year, 2022, and as we said, is now streaming on Hulu. So now we all are on one accord about her dopeness. And last but certainly not least, we have Isabel Castro, who is a 4-time Emmy-nominated Mexican-American filmmaker who combines a practice in journalism and art to tell stories about immigration, civil rights, and identity. Award-winning Mija had its world premiere at Sundance Film Festival in 2022 and is her first feature film. It was acquired by Disney Original Documentaries and is in development for a scripted series at FX Networks. Would you like to share with us about Mija?
Yeah, so we're going to watch a clip from the film. I think I chose this clip because of a couple of reasons. One is I'm looking forward to talking about style and kind of like the artistic approach to telling this film. I feel like this is this clip is a good representation of it. And I also, in learning how, because this is my first music documentary, I come from a background of doing immigration and civil rights reporting. And as I was trying to understand the genre, I think one of the things that I gravitated to was like seeing people make music, and the process of like kind of demystifying like the process of making a song and making a music video. And so this is kind of an excerpt of that goal.
Isabel, you kind of pointed us in this direction in your remarks, but this is a question to everyone. What attracted you to the stories that you ended up telling in each one of these documentaries, and how did that inform how you chose to tell the story stylistically in terms of narrative, all of those kinds of things? How was that connected for you?
My panelists are like nudging me along. I'll kick it off. I mean, so as I mentioned, like I had come from immigration reporting, civil rights reporting, been on the ground for the last 5+ years, and I was really frustrated that I felt like there was a limit to the kinds of stories that I was telling about families separated at the border, about people being charged in the desert for giving water to migrants that were crossing. I just, I was getting them on big outlets, and then there was always like a limit to how people engage with these kinds of stories. And by that, I mean, like, I felt like sometimes I just felt like I was like speaking to the same people over and over again. And so with this film, I said, okay, I want to do a film about family separation. I want to do a film about that explores the intergenerational trauma of immigration policies in the United States. But how can I do that in a way that might appeal to a different audience, that might take a completely unexpected stylistic approach? And so, yeah, I chose this clip because it's so colorful and it draws inspiration from Euphoria, and it's meant to really kind of change the visual palette and the stylistic approach to how immigration stories are told. And so, when I found these protagonists, I felt like they were the perfect women to tell this story, and that's why I took that particular approach to doing it.
Miles Davis is arguably the greatest jazz musician of all times. He's arguably the greatest musician of any genre of the 20th century. Kind of Blue is the largest selling jazz album of all times. I have no doubt that Kind of Blue will be listened to 100 years from now. If you don't know Kind of Blue, listen to it. You'll like it. And Miles Davis is a complicated character, and that was really what really interested me. That Miles Davis, as you saw, and it never entered my mind that the tune that played in the clip, he made incredibly beautiful music, but he was a real shit, and abusive to women, used drugs and all those things, and he's just an interesting character, and so that's kind of why. I went to Miles, and I wanted to make a music film. I really wanted to make a music film, and kind of what better character than Miles Davis if you want to make a music film.
Yeah, for me, this is a story that I was approached with by Fader Films and his estate, his manager, and his mother, and they were looking for a director, and I think. Up to this point in my career, I've had a sort of unique experience. I came from a pre-med background, with a lot of experience in mental health and working with people who were incarcerated or institutionalized with mental health challenges. At one point, I was answering, the hotline in New York City for families and people who were having mental health emergencies. So I was really steeped in that. And when I made my first documentary, it actually started out as a public health report that I was going to do, sort of unsanctioned and independently, which, it was just something to make myself busy when I went out to Ferguson, and it evolved into a documentary through, in large part the Firelight Lab, where I learned the ropes of the industry and just got a, creative space and kind of felt like I could identify as a filmmaker. And so it was an invitation that kind of called on a lot of my past experience to look at this person who had mental health challenges, who was embroiled in the criminal justice system, and try to make more sense of it than just, look how good his music was or look how crazy the situation was. Try to actually draw some threads. So it felt like a great opportunity to use the skills that I had built and the skills that I was continuing to build as a storyteller. I was drawn to the challenge of it, the challenge of being honest about this person, being honest with myself about the fact that many of the men who I've loved, my family, my partners, have been very problematic. And so how do we grapple with that, face to face, rather than trying to push it away and push it into some hashtag or some kind of outer space. And so, I like a challenge. I tend to do things the hard way. And this was definitely that.
I'm struck in each documentary, they do a really powerful job of telling a person's story, or in your case, Isabel, two people's story, connected to these larger concerns and issues without losing sight of the person against the backdrop of racism in Miles Davis's case, and drug addiction and abuse and all these things. It doesn't flatten their humanity. It allows them to still, and it doesn't ask the audience to make a judgment really about them, who they are, or the young women. They're not just the daughters of undocumented people. They are their full selves. And I love the choices you make to really make this a first person intimate narrative in that way. So I wondered if each of you could talk about how you approach that. Or is that something you're even thinking consciously about during the filmmaking, or how does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things with music docs for me, is that, what's the film really about? And that's kind of the thing that I'm searching for. It's not just about the music. I think that's what makes, music docs that are really good, stand out. So I'm looking for like, okay, so here's this great music, but what is it also about? And one of the great things about music docs is that, it's like sports docs. You can always go to the sport, like we did a film on Michael Vick, and you can always go to Michael Vick, running for a touchdown, when things got a little slow. And with music docs, you got the music to work with. So you have this, great base, but also kind of what is it about? And it doesn't matter if you see it as an audience and you say, oh, that film is about that, or it's about these two or three things. It doesn't matter if it kind of doesn't sink into you that way, as long as kind of I know, making the film, what it's about, that it's about something more than just, he could string together a bunch of great notes and, wasn't it nice?
I mean, for me, that was a central question. And I talked with my editor and my team early on about the fact that this was a coming-of-age story about a young man who was a musician. And so we were really looking at it through how is he working towards an identity as a man, and how is the interplay between himself and his audience and his craft and his, actions and misbehaviors playing into that kind of process, because I felt like, he's a symbol and an emblem of his generation. And all of these young people are looking for a way to make sense of the world that they've inherited. And we all know that it's moved much more quickly than we've been able to really process. So I felt like I owed it to those kids to sort of try to look at this as a process and try to honor the fact that this was a young man who was struggling with inheriting a really, really wild, violent, traumatic situation, and reflected those behaviors and then grappled with them. And I think what made it possible for me to engage in humanizing him was that he was in that struggle. And it doesn't excuse anything that he did, but he was very much trying and confronting. And I think that's a challenge that he gave to all of us. We may not behave to the extreme levels that he did, but we all have that responsibility to constantly be grappling with the darker parts of us, the hurt parts of us, etc. So it was challenging. Every day I was a little nauseous. Like, am I making this terrible person into a hero? And I think at a certain point, my editor and I had a conversation. It was like, it's not about us being comfortable. We shouldn't be comfortable. We shouldn't land. We shouldn't come to some strong, polarized conclusion. We should stay in this uncomfortable, uncertain, gray area, because that's the essence of what this human experience really is at the end of the day.
I love what you said about, I didn't think about that consciously, but it makes perfect sense as a coming-of-age story, because he was so young when he was killed. He was 20, 21. Mm-hmm. I saw a lot of parallels with like Tupac, because I remember, I'm old enough that was like devastating to us. But also, I finished the film feeling legitimate grief. I didn't know a whole lot about him. Like, when he was alive, I heard things or whatever. But I felt real grief that his life ended the way that it did in that moment of really grappling and trying to find another way. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, one of my biggest goals, and I'm kind of expanding on what I was talking about before in terms of like trying to tell a different kind of immigration story, is that I really wanted to avoid a sense of victimization. Like, I think that even in my own work, like, I have been telling stories about folks that have suffered like incredible marginalization and injustice. And for this, I really wanted to really deliberately avoid that kind of approach in telling their stories. I really wanted to make them to show how much agency they had, and in spite of all these government policies, they, you know, show the agency that they have as children of immigrants, but also that their families have. And so that was one way that I really tried to, quote unquote, like not flatten their experiences to being one of just grief. I really wanted to focus the film on the entire, like a very complicated and nuanced range of emotions, including unexpected things like guilt or resentment. And I feel like in doing so, that was the goal in terms of trying to complicate them.
Yeah, they come through as actual humans, and not just sort of these projected ideas of what it must be to be a young American of undocumented parents. It must be this way. But the beauty and the whimsy, that's the right word, that you bring to the film, I feel like in a lot of ways helps us see them even more clearly, if that makes sense, right? And then going back to Birth of the Cool, Miles Davis, you know, he has an autobiography. People have written books about him. There's so much out there about him, and yet you found ways to make us hear him anew in the story. And were there challenges with someone who's been talked about so much, who is, if people who don't know anything about jazz know who Miles Davis is that its own kind of challenge in finding your way in, or did you just kind of come to it with your own ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was that hard, you know, because I don't think that many people actually read his autobiography. I mean, it might have even been a bestseller, but that's, you know, film just reaches so many more people, you know, than books at this point. You know, maybe sad to say, but I think that one of the things, you know, that really was really important to us is that one of the first things we did was met with his family that runs the estate, you know, and said, you know, okay, and it was hard, you know, because we go into a room and they're all sitting there staring at me and like, oh, you want to make a film about Miles, huh? And yeah, and I said, you know, yeah, I want to make a film, warts and all, you know, and that's what I want to do. And in Miles's case, it was a little easier than some people because he had already written an autobiography and he had talked about drug use and his abuse of women and things like that. And I said, you know, we can't avoid that. It's out there in the world. So that's the film we've got to make, you know, or else we'll really get thrown under the bus if we ignore that stuff. And that helped us all the way through. But then, you know, I mean, you're always looking for new material and different kind of things. And, you know, we were interviewing this guy who was a friend of his, kind of a pre-interview. And he said, you know, and he had taken these pictures of Miles, these still pictures, and you know, and he said, you know, I went out and Miles said to me, you know, hey, you know, you can take some movies if you want. And so I went out and bought a movie camera and I took a course at UCLA on filmmaking, and I shot this film on Miles, and we're like, oh yeah, well, where is it? He said, it's in my basement. You know, I'm gonna go get it. You know, and he went down in his basement and got these 2 huge rolls of 16 millimeter film that he shot, and he shot a film that Miles loved boxing, and he shot some of the film was of Miles kind of, you know, boxing, shadow boxing, you know, and that's kind of how we start the film. And with his film, some of his film, we end the film with some of his film, and Miles walking on the beach and different things of Miles that you've never seen and nobody ever saw before. So, you know, it's just a matter of you know, kind of research and then, you know, getting lucky and that I think, you know, it was kind of a metaphor that, you know, Miles is shadow boxing and you know, he had this really, you know, kind of personality that he was like fighting with the world all the time, and so it became like a gem that we found.
Wow, that's a great find that you just don't know until you're talking to people, and people are like, oh yeah, I do have this thing. It's like, wait, what?
And sometimes you just got to ask the question in like 3 or 4 or 5 different ways, so you just keep saying, at one point I was doing this other film, and this guy, he said he had shot this film on People's Temple and Jim Jones, and he said he gave it away. He gave the film away to these filmmakers. He was going to try to get it back, and we worked with him for like 6 months. Do you have the film? Do you have the film? Do you have the film? He's like, no, I can't get it back. The couple I gave it to, they're getting a divorce and they can't. Da, da, da. And I said, yeah. And I said, okay, today's the last day because we got to finish the film. Do you have it? Did you get the film? He said, no, but I made a VHS copy. Do you want that?
Yes.
Yeah, so, sometimes just asking the question in the right way.
Sabaah, you mentioned something earlier, like this was a story that came to you. They were looking for a director, and his estate was involved in that. Can you talk about just what that adds? Because there's a scene in the film that I find very striking where it's like a panel interview with the manager, his mom, his aunt, I think another one of his collaborators. And it's about the accountability about domestic abuse. And I feel like that's a moment that is and we hear you off camera asking questions, and it feels like a moment that is very honest and that we don't often get to see unfold in that kind of way in a music documentary, one that a family may shy away from, especially if their loved one is no longer here. So can you talk a little bit about, they obviously wanted his story told, but the process of how you were able to work to tell a story like this?
Yeah, that was probably the most challenging part of the process. And for me, I was trying to hold several things, my reputation and the responsibility that I feel I had to the public. And then the fact that this is a family who's grieving a loss, and then the fact that I am a feminist and that I am aware of, the gender paradigm that we live in and that I'm pushing against that. And so it was about being transparent from the very, very beginning. He was able to build himself and fashion himself into a celebrity using social media. So that savvy comes from somewhere, and all the people around him were savvy. His mother was very savvy. So there was no kind of sugarcoating of anything. She was very, very aware. And even if she didn't know the filmmaking process, she understood enough about business and about communication and self-representation that I had to kind of just come to her as an equal and be really clear. I had to be really clear with Hulu that, this was a collaborator. This is a Black Jamaican mother about her son. There's not going to be a world where I can kind of take this film and do what I want with it and bring it back. We have to walk hand in hand through this accountability process. And so this was one of the last things that we shot, that the scene that you're referring to. And I had shown them cuts before. I'd shown Geneva cuts. We had negotiated scenes and framing. There had been another scene around accountability that wasn't as direct. It wasn't multiple people. It was just sort of like a more circumstantial confrontation of it. And they ended up being very uncomfortable with that. And they were uncomfortable with a number of things that were in certain cuts. And so I was like, if you want me to remove these things, you have to stand in this space of accountability and confront it directly as his only representatives. But this will be confronted. You know what I mean? We're not going to be able to skip over it. So how should we do this? And I created a space where there was authentic collaboration. For my editor and I, it was the worst thing that we're aware of has to be in the film. No one will be able to say that we didn't say the worst thing. You know what I mean? We're not going to sugarcoat it. But there's only so much that people can take of being re-traumatized. I don't think that it's of the utmost importance that we relive every negative and dark aspect of a person's experience. So we found that balance together, really, really worked to earn that trust, to be able to have that conversation on camera. And another thing that I had to remember, which was very uncomfortable, was that it's not about me. It's not about me signaling to the world just how militant I am, how righteous I am, how virtuous I am, where I stand. Once I've taken on the responsibility to tell this story, it's about this story. And so to I had to be really, really centered in a humble place to ask those questions in a way where they felt safe enough to answer those questions on camera. So I think, that's definitely one of the things that I'm most proud of, that I was able to accomplish that accountability with consent and with transparency together with them, as opposed to having to sort of extract it or use the power dynamics that are really embedded in documentary filmmaking. There was another way that I could have gone about that and really applied pressure, but I did believe that it was possible, and I'm happy that they rose to the occasion.
I love how you talk about working collaboratively with this Jamaican American mother who has lost her child. And I'm glad we get to hear you ask the questions, because you don't sound at all accusatory or judgmental, but just like sort of genuinely wondering, like, how can there be accountability if there's no admission? Like, how do those things work? And watching them think through what you're asking in real time demonstrates that there is trust there. Like, they don't feel, their posture isn't one where they feel attacked or confronted, but it is a way to really deal with that central issue in the film.
Yeah, and I was hoping really, from the space of a mental health practitioner, to model a way of entering into conversations about accountability. I think we can do a lot better collectively. Like, there's being right, and then there's moving forward. And I think that that's where a lot of us collectively are stuck. We know that we're right. We know that abuse is a problem. We know that, gender-based violence is a problem, but how do we move forward? And so I felt like I had to find that in myself if this was going to be a productive piece of work.
Thank you. And Isabel, thinking about Mija and your shift from being, not that you're not still a journalist, of course you are, but like moving into documentary filmmaking as well, what do you see as sort of the possibilities of being able to expand how we think about immigrants, not just immigration, but people? And where do you feel we are in telling these stories in the canon of music documentaries now?
First of all, I loved what you were just saying, and I just want to acknowledge that. It's something that I, like, as I learn, like, I'm still so very much in kind of a stage of learning. I'm learning how to navigate those relationships, and it's extremely challenging. So I'm glad we're having a conversation about it. But separately, to answer your question, I think that. So I felt really disillusioned by journalism. To back up even further, like, I kind of accidentally fell into journalism. It felt like a pragmatic interpretation of what I love to do, which is go out into the world and meet people and have a camera. I mean, it feels like such a gift. Like, I really adore what we do. And journalism just felt like a kind of like responsible interpretation of that. Like, I'm gonna have a job, and then I really value the function of journalism. I think it's like crucial to exposing truths and holding people accountable. But I think that particularly under the Trump administration, I felt a lot of conflict in terms of the role of, like, I just was kind of being exposed to a lot of trauma, a lot of stories that involved a lot of trauma, and I felt so I was coming at it from a place of a lot of subjectivity and what felt like activism, and journalism didn't feel like the right place to feel so angry. I wanted to interpret the world in a more subjective view. Like, I didn't want to have to go interview person A and person B, because in my view of what was happening, there was, when like kids were being separated from their families at the border, it felt so kind of like the truth as I understood it felt so clear internally, and it was really, there was a lot of dissonance between how I felt and the process of journalism and what I was being asked to do in order to report on these things. And so I kind of, tapped into, I tried to translate some of the things that I learned from journalism, some of the processes, some of the rules, some of these things that in some ways exist to protect stories, to protect storytellers, to protect participants in telling a story, but try to carry over some of those things and then also try to inject a lot more subjectivity into the way that I was telling the story. And by that I mean like having a much more subjective style and view and point of view. I wanted the film to feel like it had a really particular perspective, stylistically, tonally. And so anyway, I don't know if this answers your question. I think this is coming up a lot. I think as documentary becomes more and more commercial and starts to almost have a different function than journalism. It's like, its role, its purpose in some ways is to entertain. And I feel like, but it has historically been rooted in a journalistic practice. And I think that we're coming up against a lot of friction between those two different set of expectations. And I mean, I could talk about this forever and ever, but and I won't. But but I do think like these questions are really important to really really deconstruct and understand how we translate journalism, how we translate journalistic practice, and how we also differentiate it within documentary filmmaking too.
Thank you for that. And we're going to get ready for questions. So please, if you have them, we have 2 microphones set up. And I was just thinking about the story that you tell with Doris and Jack's Hop. There are points of it that could easily be seized upon and made sensational, right? And become like the story themselves. I'm thinking about watching Doris drive to Mexico I think it's Thanksgiving, to bring her brother food from the family. Like, people could seize on that and make that like the overarching thing, where the way you present it, it's a part of the reality of their life that her older brother has been deported, and because her parents are undocumented, they can't go see him. And this is just the way that they found to cope. It's a part of life as opposed to the singular story of her life, right? And I feel like those are the kinds of choices and impressions that you allow us to hold in our minds. So thank you. Do we have questions? Yes.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So are you thinking about turning this into a feature film? I mean, either one of your stories? I mean...
So it sounds like Isabel's in development on a fiction film. If you mean narrative or fiction.
Either. I mean, but from what you just did in your documentaries, does that ever inspire you to maybe do a feature film, a docudrama or something like that?
I have to think on that.
It seems like it would be...
So, I mean, for me, so Mija itself was a feature film, but I think that in terms of translating into like fiction, into narrative, or like extrapolating anything from these stories, there's always that temptation, because like you fall in love with this story. Like I always describe it as like you kind of marry your story for a little while. Like you really like you live and breathe the story, and at some point you just decide to stop. Like the filmmaking process like never fully stops. Like one day you just get into a festival and you say, we need to deliver this in 2 weeks, and that's it. And then you like get up from the office and you're like, well, I guess my film is done. But the film, like the story doesn't stop. That's what's weird about documentary. Like in Mija particularly, like the stories have completely shifted and changed since we started filming, and that's created some problems. It's created some tensions, and it's also kind of, from my perspective, I'm like, oh, I mean, this feels like a whole other story, So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well,
but
I say it because I'm a screenwriter and I'm also a filmmaker, and I like to write things that are true. So I'm working on a story from the 1940s that really happened, about a little girl who ends up desegregating a Hispanic school, and she becomes oppressed, her and her mother. but it's from the truth, and it's a lot of stories that I've talked to people, over 400 people, about the episode. So I'm going back. I'm going the other way. It's not a documentary, but it's more of a narrative film.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the exact opposite. When I'm finished with a film, I'm through.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I feel like I get married to my collaborators, but this film in particular, I think both my films have been a bit of a war zone for me. Personally, more like a solitary confinement than a marriage. But yeah, I'm looking forward to what I love about your film and the pieces I've seen so far is just the beauty. Like, you can see that you loved that film. You can feel the love that's there. And I hope I get an opportunity to tell a story that I can love and make sparkly.
Keep it real. If you have questions, feel free to come to the mic.
Hello, my name's Carl. I'm currently working on a doc that kind of features a group from the late 70s and early 80s. And they're still active, which is awesome. But you kind of touched on it a little bit. Like, I think with music docs, a lot of the stories are about stuff that's happened in the past, if not farther in the past. And a lot of the artists are no longer with us that the docs end up being made about. And so you touched on the idea of finding the current relevant storyline within this type of format where maybe their earlier years were where the height of their fame and, visibility happened. But now you're years later telling the story and trying to find the current narrative to go along with it to kind of bring it all together. The balance between knowing it going into it and discovering it as it happens, and how do you find that kind of current element within a story that primarily happened in the past, essentially?
I think it's a bit of both. For me with Miles, so the section that you saw, we knew that we wanted to talk about Miles's ballads, and so that we interviewed people about Miles's ballads. Now, did we know what song we were going to use? No. And did we know that the sequence was going to be like that, with those kind of beautiful stills back and forth? No. But we knew that we wanted a sequence about ballads. But I think, that some of it some of it you find out. The great thing about making docs, either present day docs or historical docs is the stuff that you find while you're going, and it's not just physical stuff like the guy who had the films in his basement. It's the story, like what is the story as you go, and hopefully you have room for the story to change. So,
do you find yourself like leaning 50% on discovering it and 50% you kind of have something in mind, or does it change with every shoot? Probably.
I think it changes, but I mean, you're making the film for a reason. So there's a certain amount of stuff that, a certain amount that's already there, right? That you're making a film for a reason. I mean, one of the things we had to hold on to it with Miles was that, we're making the film because Miles made this beautiful music and that we could go down the path of his abuse. We can go down the path of his drug abuse, but we're here because of the music, right? If Miles was just an abuser of women and a drug addict, we wouldn't have been making the movie. So that's kind of something that we hold on to. You can go down this path, but you have to figure out a way to come back and bring the audience back with you, so they're not like, wait a minute, this guy was such a shit. Wait, I think that's important.
We have time, I think, for one last quick question.
So I think it's interesting, all these music docs that are coming out where you see the participant is an exec producer on it, or they're working in concert with the filmmaker, right? You all had to enlist estates or the families. I'm wondering how they responded to the final films. We've heard of people dropping out at the last minute and disavowing the film. I'm curious, what was the response?
I want to say real quick something I've just been thinking about the whole time. If people are thinking about music docs, I think one of the things you see, especially from these two docs, I mean that and from Miles too, is that access is really important. And a lot of times, we want to make a film so bad, and they're like, okay, well, you can come to the rehearsal on Tuesday, and you can shoot us, at dinner on Friday, but and it's not enough, and you can see it in the docs. I think that's really so. It's access is really important, and for a filmmaker, it's hard because you want to make the film, and you feel like you don't have a leg to stand on, But with Miles, we immediately said, we want to make film warts and all. We want to do this. With Miles, I didn't show the family the film, at all. We got into Sundance, and so I sent the film out the day before we were leaving to go to Sundance, because I was going to Sundance. I was like, I didn't care what they said, and I didn't want to leave, and I didn't want to leave more room for them to mount a campaign against me and against the film, and his nephew, who kind of runs the estate, who we did a lot of events with, tells this story where I literally sent it to him the night before, and he was in L.A. and I was in New York, and he calls me. It's like 3 a.m, and he says, he's crying. He says, "Stanley, the film is so beautiful. The film is so great." And I was like, "Great, click." I wanted them. You want everybody to like it, but it's not totally necessary, hopefully. Like, you don't sign a contract where it's necessary.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's telling even that you framed your question in terms of participants, and I think that language speaks to something that's happening in documentary, which is evolving from a sort of almost anthropological subject observer, this false ideas of having objectivity because you don't have the full context, the relationships to the community that you're documenting, and moving towards something that honors people's humanity. And for me, it's kind of absurd to imagine, I wouldn't let someone just come along and tell a story about my life on their own terms with no input from me. You know what I mean? So to ask that of someone is a little wild. And at the same time, there has to be that boundary of, I'm the filmmaker, my reputation is on the line, here are my standards. And for me, and I think it's case by case. In this particular case, both Geneva and his mother were the targets of online harassment because of the narrative that was currently circulating. He died in 2018. So these are people who are still processing their grief, and women who are vulnerable and whose vulnerability is going to be impacted by the narrative that I tell. So it was of the utmost importance for me that Geneva see this cut well before it came out, give me feedback about how she felt about it. Having her blessing was for me was mandatory. I was willing to walk away based on how our interactions and how Hulu and the estate were going to support that part of the process. There had to be justice for her to the extent that I could create it through my actions. And then for the family, I wanted that participation. I wanted that trust. And so I had to give. And so I think it's a give and a take, and it's based off of the situation that you're in and how you protect your reputation in an industry that automatically mistrusts the idea that people should be a part of telling their own stories. That's a larger conversation. I think that's a racialized conversation. It's a class conversation. It's, there are a lot of layers to that.
I mean, it's such a complicated thing to navigate, because there is a thin line between censorship essentially and also making sure that you're honoring a story, and you're listening to how people want to show themselves, show their communities, represent themselves. And so for me, on Mija, on every film that I've done, I've showed the film ahead of time, but those conversations are sometimes not easy, and there are parts of Mija that the family and participants in the film don't like, and you have to make a really, difficult decision, and you have to be able to stand by the decision, and really reason through it.
Well, we are over time. Please join me in thanking and Firelight Media for making this panel possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Thank you all for coming. 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 Thank you all for coming.